London, 2016. A nondescript building on Leadenhall Street houses one of Britain's most carefully guarded secrets. Inside a climate-controlled vault, researchers are finally granted access to documents that have been locked away for over a century and a half. These are not just any papers. These are the internal records of the British East India Company, one of the most powerful corporations that ever existed. What they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about one of history's greatest empires. Among thousands of ledgers, letters, and memorandums, one particular document stands out. It is dated 1834, written by a senior company official whose name has been redacted from public records. The language is cold, clinical, almost businesslike, but what it describes is nothing short of calculated genocide. The memo discusses production quotas, distribution networks, and market penetration strategies. But this is not about tea or silk or porcelain. This is about opium. And the target market is an entire civilization. The document explicitly acknowledges what the company is doing. It uses phrases like dependency rates and addiction percentages. It discusses how to maximize the number of Chinese citizens who become regular users. There is no ambiguity here. No room for interpretation. This was not accidental. This was not a side effect of trade. This was the strategy. By 1835, over 12 million people in China were addicted to opium. To put that in perspective, that is 10% of the entire population of what was then the most powerful empire on Earth. An empire that controlled 1/3 of the entire planet's economy. An empire that had stood for thousands of years, and it was being systematically destroyed by a drug that was being deliberately pumped into its veins by foreign powers who knew exactly what they were doing. This is not a story about trade disputes or cultural misunderstandings. This is not about East versus West or the inevitable march of progress. This is about the greatest drug conspiracy in human history. A conspiracy so successful that it brought down a superpower. A conspiracy so carefully hidden that most people today have no idea it even happened. The question is not whether this was intentional. The documents prove it was. The question is, how did they get away with it? How did one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history fall victim to what amounts to state-sponsored drug trafficking? And why has this story been so carefully scrubbed from the history books? Here is what makes this even more disturbing. The British Empire was not just selling opium to China. They were losing a financial war. For decades, Chinese goods, especially tea, silk, and porcelain, were in massive demand in Europe. But China wanted almost nothing that Britain produced. The trade imbalance was staggering. Between 1760 and 1800, the British Empire lost over 70 million ounces of silver to China. That is not a typo. 70 million ounces of pure silver, flowing in one direction, draining the British economy. Something had to be done. But what? Direct military conquest was too expensive. The Chinese military, while technologically behind, was vast. A trade boycott would hurt Britain more than China. Diplomatic pressure went nowhere. The Chinese emperor considered European nations to be barbarian kingdoms barely worth acknowledging. So, someone came up with an idea so dark, so calculated, that it would make modern drug cartels look like amateurs. What if we could create a product that China did not just want, but needed? What if we could engineer demand where none existed? What if we could turn an entire population into customers who had no choice but to buy from us? And that is exactly what they did. Hey, this is Mr. H, and tonight we are going deep into one of the most disturbing chapters in human history. A story of empire, addiction, and betrayal on a scale that is almost hard to believe. If you are ready to see how far one nation went to destroy another, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what we are about to uncover will change how you see history forever. Now, before we get into how this conspiracy unfolded, we need to understand what China was before the opium arrived, because what happened next can only be truly appreciated when you realize what was lost. We are talking about an empire that the rest of the world both envied and feared. An empire that seemed untouchable. An empire that, by all logic, should never have fallen. But it did. And the weapon that brought it down was not guns or bombs or armies. It was something far more insidious. Something that worked slowly, quietly, from the inside out. Something that turned China's own people into the instruments of their nation's destruction. This is the story of how opium destroyed China's greatest empire. And it starts with understanding just how great that empire actually was. In 1790, China was not just a country, it was the country. The Qing dynasty controlled more wealth, more people, and more resources than any other nation on Earth, and it was not even close. Let me give you some numbers that will put this in perspective. At its peak, the Qing Empire produced roughly 1/3 of the entire world's gross domestic product. 1/3. That means out of every $3 worth of goods and services produced on planet Earth, $1 came from China. The United States today, with all its military might and technological dominance, controls about 24% of global GDP. China, in 1790, had more economic power relative to the world than America has today. The population tells an even more staggering story. China had over 300 million people. Europe, all of Europe combined, had around 180 million. The entire British Empire, including all its colonies, had maybe 90 million. China had more people than Europe and Britain combined, and then some. And these were not starving peasants barely surviving. Chinese cities were larger, cleaner, and more advanced than anything in the West. Beijing had over 1 million residents. London, the largest city in Europe, had fewer than 1 million. Chinese cities had paved streets, public sanitation systems, and organized fire brigades. London was still throwing sewage into the Thames and dealing with regular outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. But the real power of China was not just in its size, it was in what it could produce, things that nobody else on Earth could make at the same quality or scale. Chinese silk was legendary. The techniques for producing it had been perfected over 2,000 years. European attempts to replicate it failed miserably. The texture was wrong. The sheen was wrong. Everything was wrong. If you wanted real silk, you bought it from China. Chinese porcelain was even more impressive. The process for making true porcelain was a closely guarded state secret. Europeans tried for centuries to figure it out. They failed until the early 1700s, and even then, their porcelain was inferior. Chinese porcelain was translucent, incredibly strong, and could be made so thin you could see light through it. European nobility would pay fortunes for a single Chinese vase. Entire royal collections were built around Chinese ceramics. And then there was tea. By the late 1700s, tea had become an absolute obsession in Britain. The British drank tea for breakfast, tea at lunch, tea in the afternoon, tea at dinner. The entire social structure of British society revolved around tea, and every single leaf came from China. Britain tried to grow tea in India, but the results were terrible. Chinese tea was simply better, and everybody knew it. So here is the problem Britain faced. They desperately wanted Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain, all of it. But China wanted almost nothing that Britain produced. The Chinese looked at British textiles and said, "We make better ones." They looked at British metalwork and said, "We are not interested." They looked at British manufactured goods and politely declined. The only thing China would accept in payment was silver, pure silver, and Britain was running out of it. Fast. Between 1760 and 1800, Britain lost over 70 million ounces of silver to China. To understand how catastrophic this was, imagine if today, the United States had to pay for all its imports from China in gold bars. No credit, no currency exchange, just physical gold, shipped across the ocean, never to return. That is what Britain was dealing with. The British East India Company, which controlled all trade with China, was in a state of panic. Their internal documents from this period read like disaster reports. One memo from 1792 states plainly that the China trade is bleeding the empire dry. Another from 1798 warns that if current trends continue, Britain will face a currency crisis that could collapse the entire economy. They tried everything. They tried negotiating with the Chinese emperor to open up more trade, to accept British goods as payment. The emperor's response was essentially, "You have nothing we want." They tried trade boycotts, refusing to buy Chinese goods unless China bought British products. It failed. Europeans wanted tea too badly. The boycotts collapsed within months. They tried military intimidation, sending warships to Chinese ports as a show of force. The Chinese were unimpressed. They had faced down Mongol hordes, Japanese pirates, and internal rebellions that fielded armies of millions. A few British ships were not going to change their minds. Britain was stuck. They had no military solution. Invading China would require an army larger than anything Britain could field. And even if they won battles, occupying a country of 300 million people was impossible. They had no economic solution. China's economy was self-sufficient. They produced everything they needed domestically. They had no diplomatic solution. The Qing emperor considered himself the ruler of the civilized world. Foreign kings and queens were barbarians who should be grateful for permission to trade at all. So someone, somewhere in the British East India Company had a different idea. An idea that did not require winning battles or changing minds or negotiating treaties. An idea that would work slowly, invisibly, from the inside out. What if instead of trying to sell the Chinese something they wanted, we sold them something they would need? What if we could create a product so addictive, so destructive, that entire populations would empty their savings to buy it? What if we could engineer a crisis so severe that China would have no choice but to accept our terms? The product was opium, and it was already growing in massive quantities in British-controlled India. Now, opium was not new to China. It had been used for centuries as medicine, primarily for pain relief and treating dysentery, but it was rare, expensive, and tightly controlled. The Qing government had strict regulations on its import and use. Most Chinese people had never even seen it. What the British East India Company proposed was not traditional opium trade. They proposed flooding China with opium, mass production, industrial-scale distribution, prices low enough that even peasants could afford it, and most importantly, a version of opium that was specifically designed to be smoked, which was far more addictive than eating it as medicine. Before we go deeper into how this nightmare unfolded, I am curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. And what time is it where you are? Are you watching this late at night going down a history rabbit hole? Early morning with coffee? Let me know. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, all of us digging into these hidden chapters of history together. The first internal proposal for this plan appears in East India Company records from 1773. It is written by Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal, the region of India where opium poppies grew best. The memo is chillingly pragmatic. Hastings calculates potential production volumes, estimates profit margins, and projects how many Chinese customers could be created within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. He does not use the word addiction. He calls it market dependency, but he knows exactly what he is talking about. The memo includes estimates for how quickly users would increase their consumption, how much product would be needed to maintain supply, how to structure pricing to maximize both volume and profit. This was not a drug deal. This was a business plan to addict an entire civilization, and it worked beyond their wildest projections. In 1773, the British East India Company exported about 15 tons of opium to China. By 1800, it was 450 tons. By 1820, 1,000 tons. By 1838, 2,558 tons. That is an increase of over 170 times in 65 years. To put that in perspective, 2,558 tons of opium is enough to produce over 250 million individual doses. That is almost one dose for every man, woman, and child in China at the time. And that was just 1 year's supply. The profit margins were obscene. A chest of opium that cost the East India Company about £15 to produce in India could be sold in China for over £400. That is a 2,600% markup. Some shipments did even better. Certain high-quality varieties fetched £600 per chest. The opium trade became the single most profitable enterprise in the British Empire, earning more revenue than all of Britain's textile exports combined. But here is the thing that makes this truly diabolical. The East India Company did not just stumble into this. They engineered it. They controlled every step of the process, from cultivation to distribution. They set production quotas for Indian farmers, specifying exactly how much land had to be dedicated to poppy cultivation. They built processing facilities in Patna and Benares where raw opium was refined into a product specifically designed for smoking. They established quality control standards to ensure consistency. And they created a distribution network that was absolutely brilliant in its ruthlessness, because selling opium in China was illegal. The Qing government had banned opium imports back in 1729, precisely because they saw what addiction was doing to their people, so the British could not just sail into Chinese ports and openly sell opium. Instead, they created what we would today call a grey market operation. British ships would sail to Chinese waters and anchor outside the legal jurisdiction of Chinese law, typically around an island called Lintin, about 60 miles south of Canton. These ships, called receiving ships, were floating warehouses. They would hold thousands of chests of opium, just sitting there, waiting. Then, smaller, faster boats called scramble boats or fast crabs, operated by Chinese smugglers who had been bribed or coerced into cooperation, would race out to the receiving ships at night, load up with opium, and speed back to shore, landing at hidden beaches and smuggling the opium inland through networks of corrupt officials and criminal gangs. The British never technically broke Chinese law. They never entered Chinese territorial waters with opium. They just sat offshore and let the opium come to them. It was plausible deniability on a massive scale, and the corruption required to make this work was staggering. Documents show that by the 1830s, an estimated 40 to 60% of local Chinese officials were on the British payroll: customs inspectors, harbour masters, military officers, even members of the imperial bureaucracy. Everyone took bribes. Everyone looked the other way. The opium flowed inland like a river, unstoppable. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy began to collapse, because now, instead of silver flowing into China from foreign trade, silver was flowing out. Chinese citizens were spending their savings on opium. Farmers were selling their land to buy opium. Workers were pawning their tools to buy opium. The trade imbalance that had favored China for centuries suddenly reversed. By 1830, China was losing millions of ounces of silver every year. The Qing emperor watched in horror as his empire began to crumble from within. Productivity plummeted. Crime skyrocketed. Entire villages became opium dens where nothing else mattered. The military was compromised, with soldiers too addicted to function. The government was compromised, with officials too corrupt to enforce laws. And the British East India Company watched their profits soar. This is where our story takes a turn, because one man in the Chinese government decided enough was enough. His name was Lin Zexu, and he was about to start a fight that would change the course of history. But that fight, and what it led to, is a story that deserves its own chapter, because what happened next was not just a conflict between two nations. It was a war where one side fought for survival, and the other fought for the right to keep an entire country addicted to drugs. And the truly terrifying part? The side fighting for drug profits won. The year is 1773. Warren Hastings sits in his office in Calcutta, staring at a problem that most people would consider unsolvable. He is the Governor-General of Bengal, which means he controls a massive chunk of British India. His job is simple in theory: make the East India Company profitable. But there is one massive obstacle: China. Hastings is not a drug dealer. At least, he does not see himself that way. He sees himself as a businessman, solving a business problem. And the problem is this: how do you force someone to buy your product when they do not want it? His answer would reshape global history. The solution already exists, growing in the fields of Bengal: opium poppies, Papaver somniferum. The plant has been cultivated in India for centuries, used primarily for medicine. But Hastings sees something different. He sees a weapon, not a weapon of war, but a weapon of economics, a way to reverse the silver drain that is bleeding Britain dry. But here is what makes Hastings truly dangerous. He does not just want to sell opium to China. He wants to industrialize it, turn it into a machine, create a system so efficient, so brutal, that it cannot be stopped. The first step is production control. Hastings establishes what becomes known as the opium monopoly. Every poppy farmer in Bengal is now required to sell their raw opium exclusively to the East India Company at fixed prices. If they refuse, they lose their land. If they try to sell to anyone else, they face imprisonment. This is not free market capitalism. This is state-controlled drug manufacturing. The company assigns cultivation quotas. Each district must produce a specific amount of raw opium every season. Local administrators are judged not on the welfare of their people, but on whether they meet their opium targets. Farmers who cannot pay their taxes in cash are forced to pay in opium. Entire agricultural regions are converted from food production to poppy cultivation. Some areas experience food shortages because too much farmland is dedicated to drugs. The raw opium is collected and sent to two main processing centers, Patna and Benares. These facilities are unlike anything else in the world at the time. They are proto-factories, designed with one purpose: to produce the most addictive form of opium possible. See, raw opium is sticky, inconsistent, and difficult to smoke. The British develop a refining process that produces what they call prepared opium, or smoking opium. This version is dark brown, has a specific consistency, and can be easily formed into balls that are perfect for smoking. The morphine content is concentrated. The delivery method is optimized. This is not accidental. This is chemical engineering applied to addiction. Each ball of opium is stamped with the East India Company seal, guaranteeing quality. Think about that. a government-backed corporation creating a brand identity for narcotics. Today, we would call this insane. In the 1800s, it was just business. The numbers tell the story of industrialization. In 1773, Bengal produces 15 tons of processed opium for export. Within 10 years, it is 50 tons. By 1790, 150 tons. By 1800, 450 tons. This is not gradual growth. This is exponential expansion. A drug empire being built with the precision of a military campaign. But production is only half the equation. Getting the opium into China is the real challenge. And this is where the system becomes truly brilliant in its cruelty. The British face a fundamental problem. Opium is illegal in China. Has been since 1729. The Qing government banned it specifically because they recognized its destructive power. So how do you smuggle thousands of tons of illegal drugs into the most populous country on earth without getting caught? You build a navy. Not a military navy. A smuggling navy. Purpose-built ships designed for one thing: carrying opium and outrunning Chinese coastal patrols. Enter the opium clippers. These are not your standard merchant vessels. They are long, sleek, built for speed. They have reinforced hulls to withstand rough seas. They have shallow drafts so they can navigate close to shore. And they have hidden compartments where opium can be stored away from casual inspection. Companies like Jardine Matheson and Denton Company invest millions in building these ships. On paper, they are respectable British trading firms. In reality, they are the largest drug trafficking organizations in human history. William Jardine, the founder of Jardine Matheson, would later become a member of British Parliament. Today, Jardine Matheson is still one of the largest conglomerates in Asia, with business interests in everything from retail to real estate. They started by smuggling opium. The clippers sail from Calcutta to the Chinese coast, a journey that takes about 6 weeks. But they do not go to legitimate ports like Canton. Instead, they head to Linton Island, a rocky outcrop about 60 miles south of Canton, just outside the official jurisdiction of Chinese customs officials. At Linton, the clippers transfer their cargo to receiving ships. These are larger, older vessels that are permanently anchored offshore. They serve as floating warehouses, sometimes holding 5,000 to 10,000 chests of opium at a time. Each chest contains about 140 pounds of opium, enough for roughly 14,000 individual doses. Now comes the distribution network, and this is where the system becomes frighteningly sophisticated. Chinese smugglers, operating in fast boats called scramble boats or centipedes because of their many oars, row out to the receiving ships under cover of darkness. They load up with as many chests as they can carry and race back to shore, landing at hidden beaches or river inlets. The entire transaction takes less than an hour. But these smugglers are not working alone. They are part of a massive criminal network that has been carefully cultivated by the British. Local Chinese merchants act as middlemen, distributing the opium inland. Secret societies like the Triads provide muscle and security. And most crucially, Chinese government officials provide protection. The corruption is systematic. British records from this period, the ones that were locked away until 2016, show detailed accounts of bribery payments. Harbour masters receive regular stipends to ignore smuggling activities. Customs inspectors are paid to lose paperwork. Local magistrates are compensated to look the other way when opium dens open in their jurisdictions. Military commanders accept bribes to ensure their soldiers do not interfere with smuggling routes. One document from 1828 lists payments to over 40 different Chinese officials in the Canton region alone. The amounts vary from a few $100s to several thousand, depending on the official's rank and usefulness. This is not spontaneous corruption. This is a managed bribery operation, with budgets, payrolls, and performance reviews. By the 1830s, it is estimated that between 40 and 60% of local officials in coastal China are compromised. The Qing government in Beijing issues orders to crack down on opium smuggling, but those orders die at the local level because the people responsible for enforcing them are on the British payroll. The opium flows inland along rivers and canals, following trade routes that have existed for centuries. It reaches every province, every major city, eventually every village, and wherever it goes, addiction follows. But why is opium so devastatingly effective? Why does it destroy lives in a way that alcohol or tobacco, which are also addictive, do not? The answer lies in chemistry. Opium contains morphine, one of the most powerful natural painkillers ever discovered. When smoked, Morphine enters the bloodstream through the lungs and reaches the brain within seconds. It binds to opioid receptors, flooding the brain with dopamine and creating a sense of euphoria, warmth, and peace. For someone living in Qing, China, where life expectancy is low, work is brutal, and suffering is common, that feeling is transcendent. It is an escape from pain, from worry, from the grinding hardship of daily existence. For a few hours, nothing hurts, nothing matters. The world is soft and distant. But here is the trap. The brain adapts. After repeated use, usually within 2 to 3 weeks of daily smoking, the brain reduces its natural production of dopamine and increases the number of opioid receptors. This means you need more opium to achieve the same effect. And when you stop using, your brain is left with too many receptors and not enough dopamine. The result is withdrawal. Opium withdrawal is agony. Documented accounts from Chinese physicians of the era describe symptoms that sound like torture: severe muscle pain, as if your bones are breaking, uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, fever and chills, alternating rapidly, hallucinations, intense anxiety and paranoia, and an overwhelming, desperate craving for more opium. The withdrawal lasts for days, sometimes weeks. Most people cannot endure it. They go back to the drug, and each time they quit and relapse, the addiction becomes stronger. Eventually, they are not smoking opium to feel good. They are smoking it to avoid feeling terrible. And here is the most damning evidence that the British knew exactly what they were doing. Internal East India Company documents from the 1820s include reports on dependency rates. They track how long it takes for new users to become regular customers. They calculate relapse rates for people trying to quit. They discuss pricing strategies designed to keep addicts hooked while maximizing revenue. One memo from 1832 explicitly states that maintaining a stable customer base requires ensuring that supply remains consistent and affordable enough that users do not attempt prolonged withdrawal. In other words, keep the prices low enough that addicts can always afford their next dose. This is not accidental. This is addiction management as corporate strategy. The human cost is staggering. By 1835, an estimated 12 million Chinese people are addicted to opium. That is 10% of the population. But the distribution is not even. Addiction rates are highest among urban workers, soldiers, and lower-level government officials. In some coastal cities, addiction rates reach 30 to 40% of adult males. The economic impact is catastrophic. Opium addicts struggle to work. Farmers neglect their fields. Craftsmen produce inferior goods. Soldiers become unreliable. The entire productivity of the Chinese economy begins to decline. But the social destruction is even worse. Families are torn apart. Men sell their possessions, then their wives' jewelry, then their children, to buy opium. Women turn to prostitution to support their addictions. Children are abandoned or sold into servitude. Crime rates explode as desperate addicts steal to fund their habits. Opium dens spring up everywhere. These are dark, cramped rooms where dozens of people lie on wooden platforms, smoking pipe after pipe. The smell is sweet and sickening. The atmosphere is one of complete despair. People enter these dens and sometimes do not leave for days, smoking until their money runs out, then stumbling home to find more funds and return. Chinese writers of the period describe opium dens as ante-chambers of hell. One account from 1838 describes walking past a den and seeing dozens of people lying motionless, their eyes vacant, pipes still clutched in their hands, looking more dead than alive. And through it all, the silver continues to flow out of China. By 1830, the trade balance has completely reversed. China is now losing approximately 9 million ounces of silver every year. The imperial treasury is depleting. The economy is in free fall. The Qing government is facing a crisis unlike anything in its history. In Beijing, the Daoguang emperor receives reports of the devastation and makes a decision. He appoints a man named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with a single mission: end the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin Zexu is about to become the most hated man in the British Empire, because he is going to do something that no one expects. He is going to fight back, and his fight is going to trigger a war that will be remembered as one of the most unjust conflicts in human history. But before we get to that war, you need to understand something. The British do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as traders, engaging in free commerce. When Lin Zexu starts confiscating opium, they are going to call it theft. When he starts arresting British smugglers, they are going to call it aggression. And when he destroys their drugs, they are going to demand war. The empire that created the opium trade, that engineered addiction on an industrial scale, that bribed officials and corrupted an entire nation, is going to claim that they are the victims. And the truly insane part is that most people back in Britain are going to believe them. Lin Zexu arrives in Canton on March 10th, 1839. He is 54 years old, a respected scholar official with a reputation for honesty in a government drowning in corruption. The Daoguang Emperor has given him unprecedented authority. He can arrest anyone, confiscate anything, execute anyone who stands in his way. His mandate is simple and absolute: destroy the opium trade. What Lin discovers in his first week shocks him to his core. And this is a man who has spent decades in imperial service, who thinks he has seen everything. The addiction is everywhere, not just in the ports, not just among the poor, it is in the military. Over 30% of soldiers in the southern garrisons are addicted. Some units are completely useless. Their commanders too high to give orders. Their troops too sick from withdrawal to fight. Lin inspects one military base and finds officers openly smoking opium in the middle of the day. When he demands to know why no one stopped them, a junior officer quietly explains that the commanding general is also an addict. The imperial bureaucracy is compromised top to bottom. Lin starts investigating officials in Canton and discovers that many of them are not just taking bribes from opium smugglers. They are smugglers themselves. They use their positions to facilitate the trade, then pocket the profits. When Lin orders arrests, some officials flee before he can seize them. Others commit suicide rather than face interrogation. One magistrate, when confronted with evidence of his involvement, breaks down and confesses that his entire extended family depends on opium money. His salary as a government official is not enough to support them. The bribes are. Lin realizes something terrible. This is not a problem he can arrest his way out of. The corruption is too deep. The addiction is too widespread. If he tries to round up every Chinese person involved in the opium trade, he would need to arrest millions. So he makes a strategic decision. He is going to cut off the head of the snake. He is going to go after the British. On March 18th, Lin summons all foreign merchants in Canton to a meeting. He delivers an ultimatum: surrender all opium in your possession within 3 days. Sign a bond promising never to smuggle opium again, on penalty of death and confiscation of your ships. If you refuse, you will be expelled from China permanently. The British merchants laugh at him. Not openly, but in their private correspondence, they mock the ultimatum. One merchant writes to his partners in London that the commissioner is posturing, that Chinese officials always make big threats and then accept bribes to back down. Another writes that this will blow over in a few weeks once Lin realizes how much money he is leaving on the table by not cooperating. They have no idea who they are dealing with. When 3 days pass and the merchants have not complied, Lin acts. He surrounds the foreign quarter of Canton with troops, thousands of soldiers. He cuts off all food and water to the area. He stations guards at every exit. No one leaves, no one enters. The foreign merchants and their families are now hostages. Then Lin delivers a message to Charles Elliot, the British Chief Superintendent of Trade in China. It is written in classical Chinese, formal and polite in its language, but absolutely clear in its meaning. You have brought poison into my country. You have corrupted my people. You have enriched yourselves on the suffering of millions. This ends now. Surrender the opium, or watch your people starve. Elliot panics. He is a government official, not a merchant, but he is responsible for British interests in China. He sends urgent messages to the merchants, begging them to comply. They refuse. The opium belongs to them, not the British government. Why should they hand over millions of pounds worth of merchandise? So Elliot does something extraordinary. He writes a guarantee. He promises that the British government will compensate the merchants for any opium they surrender, full value, paid by the Crown. It is an astonishing commitment, one he has no authority to make, but it works. Faced with the choice between losing their opium to Chinese confiscation or surrendering it with a promise of compensation, the merchants agree. Over the next 6 weeks, the opium comes in, chests and chests and chests of it. The numbers are staggering. By the time the last chest is handed over, Lin has confiscated 20,283 chests. Each chest contains roughly 140 pounds of opium. That is approximately 2.8 million pounds of opium, 1,400 tons, enough to produce over 280 million individual doses. The value is obscene. At current market prices, the confiscated opium is worth approximately £2 million sterling. In today's money, Accounting for inflation and relative economic power, that is somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. Lin has just seized one of the largest drug caches in human history. Now comes the question, what do you do with 1,400 tons of opium? Lin makes a decision that will echo through history. He is going to destroy it, publicly. He is going to make a statement that China will not tolerate this poison. Not now, not ever. Starting on June 3rd, 1839, at a beach near the Bogue forts outside Canton, Lin oversees the destruction of the opium. His method is specific and symbolic. Workers dig 3 large trenches near the waterline. They line the trenches with stones. Then they fill the trenches with water mixed with salt and lime. The opium is brought in and thrown into the trenches. The salt and lime break down the opium chemically, dissolving it into a toxic sludge. Workers stir the mixture with poles to ensure complete destruction. Then, at high tide, they open channels and let the ocean wash the dissolved opium out to sea. The process takes 23 days. From June 3rd to June 25th, workers destroy chest after chest of opium. Crowds gather to watch. Lin issues a public statement explaining what he is doing and why. He frames it in moral terms. This is not just about law enforcement. This is about the soul of China. This is about rejecting corruption and foreign exploitation. But Lin knows that destroying the opium is not enough. He needs to send a message to the British government, so he writes a letter, not to Charles Eliot, not to the merchants, to Queen Victoria herself. The letter is extraordinary. It is respectful but firm. Lin appeals to what he assumes are shared moral values. He writes, "We have heard that in your honourable nation, the people are not permitted to smoke opium. If it is forbidden to do harm in your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries." He continues, "Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honourable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused. We have heard that you strictly prohibit opium in your country, indicating unmistakably that you know full well how harmful it is. So long as you do not take it yourselves, but continue to make it and tempt the people of China to buy it, you are making yourself an enemy of China." The logic is airtight. If opium is bad enough to ban in Britain, why is Britain selling it to China? If Britain claims to be a Christian nation with high moral standards, why is it profiting from addiction and death? The letter never receives a response. It probably never reaches Queen Victoria. But even if it did, it would not matter. Because by the time Lin writes his letter, the British government has already decided on war. See, the moment Charles Eliot guaranteed compensation for the seized opium, he created a political crisis in London. The British government now owes merchants £2 million. That is an enormous sum, roughly 10% of the government's annual revenue. Parliament is furious. Who authorised this payment? Why should British taxpayers compensate merchants for illegal drugs confiscated by a foreign government? The merchants launch a lobbying campaign. They have powerful friends. William Jardine, the opium smuggler, is now a member of Parliament. He has access to the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston. The merchant lobby argues that this is not about opium. This is about British honour. This is about free trade. This is about teaching China that you cannot treat British citizens this way and get away with it. The newspapers pick up the story, but they do not report it accurately. They do not mention that the merchants were smuggling illegal drugs. They report that China has committed an act of aggression against British commerce. They report that British property has been stolen. They report that British citizens were held hostage. The word opium barely appears in most coverage. When it does, it is framed as a minor detail, a legal technicality. The real story, according to the British press, is Chinese tyranny versus British rights. In Parliament, the debate is fierce. William Gladstone, future Prime Minister, gives one of the most powerful speeches of his career. He calls the war unjust. He calls it immoral. He states plainly, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated to cover this country with disgrace, I do not know, and I have not read of." He continues, "We, the enlightened and civilized Christians, are pursuing objects at variance both with justice and with religion. We, the enlightened and civilized Christians, are pumping into that country a poison which they will not take, whilst we will not take it ourselves because we know its effects." Other members of Parliament echo his concerns. They point out that opium is illegal in China. They argue that Britain has no moral or legal standing to demand compensation for confiscated contraband. They warn that this war will stain Britain's reputation for generations. But the merchant lobby is too strong. And Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, is determined. He frames the issue in terms of British prestige. He argues that if Britain allows China to seize British property without consequences, every other nation will think Britain is weak. He insists that this is about establishing the principle that British subjects have the right to conduct business anywhere in the world without interference. The vote is called for war, 271 votes. Against war, 262 votes. The margin is 9 votes. 9 votes send Britain to war with China over the right to sell opium. Let that sink in. The British Parliament, by a margin so thin you could call it a tie, authorises a war to force China to accept opium imports, not to defend British territory, not to protect British citizens from attack, to defend drug smugglers. The British military mobilises 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 27 transports carrying 4,000 troops. The fleet sets sail for China in June of 1840. The First Opium War has begun. And here is where the tragedy becomes complete, because China never had a chance. Not militarily, not technologically. The Qing military, for all its size and history, is about to face weapons they cannot comprehend and tactics they cannot counter. British warships are made of iron. They are powered by steam engines, meaning they do not depend on wind and can maneuver in any conditions. They carry explosive shells that can destroy wooden ships with a single hit. They have rifled cannons accurate at ranges where Chinese cannons cannot even reach them. Chinese war junks are made of wood. They rely on sails and oars. Their cannons are smooth bore, inaccurate beyond a few hundred yards. They have no explosive shells. Most importantly, Chinese naval tactics are based on boarding and hand-to-hand combat, but British ships never let them get close enough to board. The first major engagement happens at Chuenpi in January 1841. 29 Chinese war junks face 4 British warships. The battle lasts less than an hour. The British ships sit at a distance and methodically destroy the Chinese fleet. Explosive shells set the wooden junks on fire. When Chinese crews try to close the distance, British ships simply steam away, turn, and fire again. It is not a battle, it is target practice. By the end, 15 Chinese ships are sunk or burning. Hundreds of Chinese sailors are dead, British casualties, 0 killed, a handful wounded. This pattern repeats across every engagement. At the First Battle of Canton, British forces bombard Chinese positions from ranges where return fire is impossible. At the Battle of the Bogue, British steamers tow sailing ships into position, allowing them to attack from unexpected angles. The Chinese fight bravely. They use fireboats, trying to ram and burn British ships. They launch night raids in small boats. They attempt guerrilla tactics along rivers. Nothing works. The technology gap is too vast. It is like fighting with swords against machine guns. The British fleet moves north, capturing port after port. They blockade the Yangtze River, cutting off grain shipments to Beijing. The Qing government faces a choice: surrender or watch the capital starve. On August 29th, 1842, Chinese officials sign the Treaty of Nanking. The terms are devastating. China must pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, 6 million for destroyed opium, 3 million for debts owed to British merchants, 12 million for war costs. China must open 5 ports to British trade: Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai. China must cede Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. And most humiliatingly, China must grant British citizens extraterritoriality, meaning they can only be tried in British courts, even for crimes committed on Chinese soil. The treaty does not explicitly legalize opium. That would be too obvious. But it establishes the framework that makes opium smuggling easier than ever. With 5 ports open and British citizens immune from Chinese law, the opium trade explodes. Lin Zexu, the man who started all this by trying to enforce his country's laws, is blamed for the defeat. He is stripped of his titles, exiled to the far western frontier, sent to fight Muslim rebels in Xinjiang. He dies there, broken and forgotten, never knowing that history would remember him as a hero who tried to save his country from destruction. The British celebrate. They have won a glorious victory. They have defended free trade. They have taught the arrogant Chinese a lesson. Back in London, investors in the opium trade see their stock prices soar. The merchants receive their compensation. The East India Company reports record profits. And in China, the opium keeps flowing, more than ever before. The Treaty of Nanking does not end China's nightmare. It makes the nightmare permanent. Within months of the treaty signing, Opium imports double, then triple. The 5 treaty ports become drug distribution hubs, funneling opium into every corner of the empire. And now, it is all semi-legal, protected by treaties signed under the threat of military force. Chinese officials who try to interfere face British warships. Chinese citizens who complain have no recourse. The empire that controlled 1/3 of global wealth is now a captive market for foreign drugs. By 1850, the numbers are apocalyptic. Conservative estimates put the number of opium addicts in China at 12 million. That is the official figure, based on government surveys that almost certainly undercount the reality. Some Western observers at the time suggest the real number is closer to 15 or even 20 million people. We are talking about roughly 10% of the entire population physically dependent on a foreign substance. But raw numbers do not capture what is actually happening on the ground. Because addiction is not evenly distributed, it concentrates in specific populations, and those populations are the ones China needs most. Start with the military. A British naval officer visiting Canton in 1852 writes in his diary about inspecting Chinese defensive positions. He describes soldiers lying in the sun, too weak to stand at attention, officers who cannot give coherent orders, weapons left uncleaned, fortifications unmaintained. He writes, and I am quoting here, "The Chinese military is not an army. It is a collection of opium addicts in uniform." The officer is not exaggerating. Internal Qing military reports from this period, documents that were not meant to be public, estimate that between 30 and 40% of soldiers in southern China are addicted to opium. In some units, the rate is over 50%. These are not recreational users. These are men who smoke multiple times a day, who cannot function without it, who will abandon their posts to find more opium if supply runs short. What happens when your military collapses from the inside? You find out very quickly, because just as the opium epidemic reaches its peak, China faces the deadliest civil war in human history. 1850. A failed civil service exam candidate named Hong Xiuquan starts a rebellion in southern China. He claims to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He promises to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a heavenly kingdom. It sounds absurd. It should have been crushed immediately. Instead, it becomes a wildfire, because the Qing military cannot respond. The soldiers are too sick, too addicted, too demoralized. Hong's rebels sweep through province after province, encountering almost no resistance. They capture Nanjing, one of China's most important cities, and make it their capital. Within 3 years, the Taiping Rebellion controls territory containing over 30 million people. The war lasts 14 years. 14 years of unimaginable carnage. Entire cities are besieged and starved. Populations are massacred. Farmland is burned. The death toll is estimated between 20 and 30 million people. To put that in perspective, World War I killed 17 million. The Taiping Rebellion killed more people than the First World War, and it happened in one country over the same period of time. And here is the connection that most history books gloss over. The Taiping Rebellion was not caused by opium, but the Qing dynasty's inability to respond effectively absolutely was. A healthy, functioning military would have crushed the rebellion in its early stages. But the Qing military was not healthy. It was crippled by addiction, weakened by decades of opium infiltration. British observers at the time saw the connection clearly. One British diplomat writes in 1853 that the rebellion has been facilitated by the deplorable state of the Chinese forces, whose efficiency has been undermined by opium. Another writes that the empire's weakness is our doing, and we must live with the consequences. But living with the consequences does not mean stopping the opium trade. If anything, the chaos creates opportunity. With the Qing government distracted by civil war, opium smuggling becomes even easier. More ports are opened, more officials are bribed. The volume increases year after year. By 1860, China is importing roughly 5,000 tons of opium annually. That is enough for 500 million individual doses. The economic impact is crushing. Every ounce of opium must be paid for in silver. The silver drain, which was bad before the Opium Wars, becomes catastrophic. In the decade of the 1850s alone, China loses over 100 million ounces of silver to opium purchases. That silver does not just disappear. It goes to British India, where it funds the expansion of the British Empire. It goes to British merchants, who build mansions in London and estates in the countryside. It goes to British banks, which finance railways and factories and ships. The Industrial Revolution, the thing that made Britain the world's superpower, was partially funded by Chinese silver paid for opium. Britain literally built its future by destroying China's. But let us talk about what that destruction actually looks like at the human level, because statistics like 12 million addicts or 30 million dead are so large they become abstract. They do not convey the reality of what is happening in Chinese villages, in Chinese families, in the lives of individual human beings. There is a missionary named Reverend Medhurst who travels through rural China in the 1850s. He keeps a journal. The entries are devastating. He describes entering villages where every adult male is an addict. Fields are untended, crops are dying, but the men lie in opium dens, too sick or too high to care. He describes women selling their children's clothes to buy opium for their husbands. He describes children, some as young as 8 or 9, already addicted because their parents blow smoke in their faces to keep them quiet. In one village, Medhurst meets a farmer who sold his land to buy opium. Now he has no land, no opium, and no way to feed his family. The man is in withdrawal, shaking and vomiting, begging for help. Medhurst gives him money for food. The man uses it to buy opium. Medhurst writes, "I have witnessed poverty and suffering across the world, but I have never seen despair so complete as what opium creates." Another observer, a French doctor working in Shanghai, documents the medical catastrophe. Opium addicts suffer from severe malnutrition because they lose their appetite for food. They suffer from respiratory diseases because smoking damages their lungs. They suffer from infections because their immune systems are compromised. Life expectancy for heavy opium users drops to around 40 years, a full 20 years below the already low average for China at the time. The social fabric disintegrates. Traditional Chinese culture places enormous emphasis on family obligation, respect for parents, care for children. Opium destroys all of that. Addicted fathers abandon their responsibilities. Addicted mothers neglect their children. Extended families, which have been the foundation of Chinese society for millennia, fall apart as members steal from each other to fund their addictions. Crime explodes. In Canton, robberies increase by 300% between 1840 and 1850. Murder rates double. Prostitution, previously rare outside major cities, becomes common even in small towns as desperate women sell themselves for opium money. Chinese officials report that banditry is out of control, with gangs of addicts robbing travelers and raiding villages. The opium dens themselves are scenes from hell. A British traveler describes one in graphic detail. It is a large room, windowless, lit by a few oil lamps. The air is thick with sweet, cloying smoke that makes breathing difficult. Wooden platforms line the walls, each platform holding 5 or 6 people lying side by side. Most are men, but there are women too, and even a few teenagers. They lie motionless except for the mechanical action of preparing and smoking the pipe. Heat the opium ball over a flame. Press it into the pipe bowl. Inhale deeply. Hold it. Exhale slowly. Repeat. Some have been there for hours, maybe days. Their eyes are glazed. Their skin is grey. Some are so far gone they have fouled themselves and do not even notice. The traveller writes that the smell is indescribable. A mixture of opium, unwashed bodies, urine, and decay. He tries to speak to some of the smokers, but most cannot form coherent sentences. One man, middle-aged, well-dressed, manages to say that he was once a teacher. He lost his position because he kept missing work. His wife left him. He has not seen his children in 2 years. He knows he is dying. He does not care. This is happening in every city, every town, increasingly in every village across China. Millions of people trapped in the same cycle. And the truly horrifying part is that many of them know exactly what is happening to them. They know opium is destroying them. They try to quit, but withdrawal is too painful, the cravings too strong, and the opium is always available. Some do manage to quit. There are treatment centers, mostly run by missionaries or Buddhist monks, that try to help addicts through withdrawal. The process is brutal. Patients are essentially locked in rooms for weeks, given minimal food and water, left to suffer through the physical agony until it passes. Many do not survive. Their bodies, weakened by years of opium use, cannot handle the stress. Those who do survive often relapse within months because the psychological addiction remains. The Qing government tries everything they can think of. They issue edicts making opium use punishable by death. It does not work. There are too many users, too many dealers, too much corruption. They try to grow domestic opium to at least stop the silver drain. This backfires spectacularly. Now, instead of just imported opium, there is also locally grown opium. which is cheaper and more available. Addiction rates actually increase. They try negotiating with the British to stop the trade. The British refuse. Lord Palmerston, in a letter to the British minister in China, writes explicitly that Britain has no intention of restricting opium exports because it is too profitable. He frames it as a matter of individual liberty. If Chinese people want to buy opium, that is their choice. The British government cannot interfere with free commerce. This is the same government that has strict laws against opium use in Britain itself, the same government that bans opium dens in London. But somehow, Chinese liberty to destroy themselves is sacred, while British restrictions are common sense. By 1856, the Qing government is so desperate, they try one last diplomatic push. They send representatives to renegotiate the Treaty of Nanking, asking for modifications that would at least allow them to inspect British ships for opium. The British response is to start another war. The Second Opium War begins over an incident so trivial it would be funny if the consequences were not so tragic. A Chinese-owned ship called the Arrow is suspected of piracy. Chinese officials board it and arrest the crew. The ship is registered in Hong Kong, technically making it a British vessel. The British claim this is an insult to the British flag and demand an apology. China refuses. Britain declares war. France joins in because a French missionary was executed in China, and they want revenge. It is the flimsiest justification for war imaginable, but it does not matter. The real goal is to expand the opium trade even further. This time, the military campaign is even more brutal. British and French forces not only defeat Chinese armies, they deliberately target cultural sites. In October of 1860, Allied forces reach Beijing. They loot the old summer palace, the Yuan Ming Yuan, one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in the world. The palace is enormous, covering over 800 acres. It contains thousands of buildings, gardens, lakes, and libraries. It houses art treasures collected over centuries, including jade carvings, silk paintings, ancient bronzes, and books that do not exist anywhere else. It is, in many ways, the cultural heart of China. The British and French spend 3 days looting it. They take everything valuable they can carry. Soldiers fill their packs with gold, silver, jewelry, and art. Officers claim the most valuable pieces for themselves. One British officer writes that he personally took jade pieces worth thousands of pounds. Another describes filling an entire cart with silk scrolls. Then they burn it. On orders from Lord Elgin, the British commander, they set the entire complex on fire. It burns for 3 days. Thousands of buildings are destroyed. Irreplaceable art and literature are lost forever. The destruction is so complete that today, only ruins remain. Why? According to Elgin, it is punishment. The Chinese government needs to learn that actions have consequences. The real message is crueler. This is what happens when you resist us. This is what happens when you try to enforce your laws against our interests. We will not just defeat you militarily, we will erase your culture. The Treaty of Tientsin, signed in 1860, is even more humiliating than the first treaty. China must pay enormous reparations, 8 million taels of silver. More ports are open to foreign trade, eventually totaling over 20 ports. Foreign diplomats are allowed to establish permanent legations in Beijing. Christian missionaries are granted freedom to proselytize anywhere in China. And critically, opium is legalized. Not officially, the word opium does not appear in the treaty, but the treaty legalizes free trade in all goods except those specifically prohibited. And the British make sure opium is not on the prohibited list. For the first time, opium can be imported legally, taxed by the Chinese government, and sold openly. The Qing government has no choice but to comply. They are bankrupt, their military is broken, their capital has been invaded and looted. They sign whatever the British and French demand. The opium trade skyrockets. By 1870, imports reach 6,500 tons annually. By 1880, 7,000 tons. By 1890, 9,000 tons. And this is just imported opium. Domestic production, which the government has given up trying to stop, adds thousands more tons. By the end of the 19th century, an estimated 40 million Chinese people are addicted to opium. That is roughly 25% of the adult male population. In some regions, addiction rates reach 40 or even 50%. China has become a nation of addicts, and there is no way out. The empire that once controlled a third of global wealth is now dependent on foreign loans just to survive. The empire that once dictated terms to foreign traders now hosts foreign armies on its soil. The empire that once considered itself the center of civilization is now called the sick man of Asia by Western newspapers. And through it all, the opium keeps flowing. British ships, British merchants, British banks, all profiting from Chinese suffering. The money goes to build railways in India, factories in Manchester, banks in London. British shareholders receive dividends. British workers get jobs. The British Empire reaches its peak, the largest empire in human history, controlling a quarter of the world's land and people. It is all built, at least partially, on Chinese corpses, on Chinese silver, on the calculated destruction of a civilization that once stood above all others. This is not accidental. This is not an unfortunate side effect of trade. This is deliberate. This is systematic. This is, by any reasonable definition, one of the greatest crimes in human history. And somehow, it has been largely forgotten, or worse, reframed as something else, as trade disputes, as cultural clashes, as the inevitable collision between traditional and modern worlds. But the documents tell a different story. The documents that were locked away for over a century. The documents that showed profit calculations and addiction rates and market penetration strategies. Those documents reveal the truth. This was not trade. This was not modernization. This was drug trafficking as imperial policy. And it worked exactly as planned. Here is something that should disturb you. Right now, in Britain, there are students studying for their history exams who have never heard the phrase Opium Wars. Or if they have, they know it as a minor footnote, a brief conflict over trade policy. The systematic destruction of China through state-sponsored drug trafficking? That is not in the curriculum. This is not an accident. This is the result of over 150 years of careful historical revision. The story of how Britain rewrote this chapter of history is almost as disturbing as the original crime. It starts immediately after the wars. British newspapers in the 1840s and 50s almost never use the term Opium War. They call it the Chinese War or the China Trade War, or sometimes just the China Campaign. The word opium appears rarely, and when it does, it is buried in the middle of long articles about trade disputes and diplomatic insults. This is deliberate framing. If you call something the Opium War, you are admitting what it was about. You are admitting that British forces went to war to defend drug smugglers. But if you call it the Chinese War, you shift the focus. Now it sounds like China was the aggressor. Now it sounds like Britain was simply responding to Chinese provocation. The textbooks follow the same pattern. A history textbook published in London in 1858 describes the conflict this way. The Chinese government, in a fit of arbitrary tyranny, seized and destroyed British property without compensation. British honour demanded a response. A small naval expedition was dispatched to obtain redress and secure fair terms of trade. Notice what is missing. No mention that the British property was illegal narcotics. No mention that thousands of tons of opium were being smuggled into China against Chinese law. No mention of the millions of Chinese people dying from addiction. Just arbitrary tyranny and British honour. This version of events becomes the standard narrative. By the 1870s, most British citizens genuinely believe their country fought a war to defend free trade against Chinese protectionism. The opium is an uncomfortable detail that polite society does not discuss. But some people know the truth. Some people are haunted by it. William Gladstone, who opposed the war in Parliament, never stops talking about it. After he becomes Prime Minister, he calls the Opium Wars the most disgraceful episode in British history. In an 1880 speech, he says that Britain committed a crime which has earned for us the execration of mankind. But Gladstone is an outlier. Most British politicians prefer to ignore the subject entirely. When it does come up in Parliament, they use euphemisms. They talk about certain aspects of the China trade that were regrettable but necessary. They insist that Britain had no choice, that Chinese intransigence forced their hand. They claim that, in hindsight, the wars actually helped China by forcing it to modernize and engage with the world. This last argument is particularly insidious. The idea that brutal conquest is actually a favor to the conquered, that destroying a civilization is actually saving it from itself. It is colonialism's favorite lie, and Britain tells it about China for decades. Meanwhile, the physical evidence is being carefully managed. After the sacking of the old Summer Palace, the British and French take thousands of artifacts back to Europe. These items end up in museums, private collections, auction houses. Today, you can walk through the British Museum and see Chinese treasures that were stolen in 1860. The museum labels say they were acquired, or collected, or brought to Britain. The word looted does not appear. China has been asking for these items back for over a century. The British Museum's official position is that the artifacts are part of world heritage and should remain accessible to global audiences in London. The subtext is clear. We took these items in war, and we are keeping them. Possession is 9/10 of the law, even when the possession started with theft. The same thing happens with documents. The British East India Company's internal records, the ones that detail production quotas and addiction rates and bribery payments, are not made public. They are filed away in the company archives, which eventually become part of the British Library's collection. Access is restricted. Researchers need special permission. The most damaging documents are classified. This continues for over 150 years. Historians who want to study the opium trade have to work with limited sources. Official government records that present the British perspective. Published accounts from merchants and diplomats that downplay the opium angle. Chinese sources that Western academia largely ignores because they are considered unreliable or propagandistic. Then, in 2016, something changes. The British Library, under pressure from academic institutions and transparency advocates, agrees to digitize and release large portions of the East India Company archives. Over 2 million documents, some never before seen by outside researchers. What emerges is damning. Internal memos discussing how to maximize Chinese addiction rates. Profit calculations that treat human suffering as a cost-benefit variable. Letters between company officials and British government ministers showing that everyone at the highest levels knew exactly what was happening. One document, dated 1834, is particularly shocking. It is a report from a company official in Canton discussing market expansion strategies. He writes, and this is a direct quote, "Our goal must be to create dependency across all social classes. Once the scholar official class is compromised, enforcement of prohibitions becomes impossible. Estimated timeline to market saturation, 15 to 20 years. This is not trade. This is biowarfare. This is a calculated plan to addict China's leadership class to ensure they cannot resist British interests." And it worked. By the 1850s, a significant portion of the Qing bureaucracy was compromised by addiction or corruption related to the opium trade. Another document from 1840, just before the First War, shows that the British government explicitly decided that military action was preferable to negotiation because a war would result in territorial concessions that would permanently secure British access to Chinese markets. The opium was not the only goal. It was the tool to achieve larger strategic objectives. When these documents are released, there is a brief flurry of media attention. Some newspapers run stories, some academics write papers, but it does not become a major scandal. It does not fundamentally change how the opium wars are remembered in Britain. Why? Because the narrative is too entrenched. Because acknowledging the full truth would require confronting uncomfortable questions about the British Empire's legacy. Because modern Britain's relationship with China is complicated enough without dragging up historical crimes. The official British government response to the document release is carefully worded. A Foreign Office spokesman says that the Opium Wars represent a complex period in British-Chinese relations, and that while certain aspects were deeply regrettable, they should be understood in their historical context. There is no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just regret, which is not the same thing as responsibility. Compare this to how Germany handles the Holocaust. Germany teaches it extensively in schools. There are memorials and museums dedicated to remembering and atoning for the crimes. German leaders have repeatedly apologized and paid reparations. The message is clear. We did this. It was evil. We take responsibility. Britain does not do this with the Opium Wars. There are no memorials to the Chinese victims. No reparations have ever been paid. British schools barely teach the subject. When they do, it is framed as a conflict between two empires, not as a drug cartel operation run by the British state. This matters because the legacy continues. Hong Kong, seized as a direct result of the Opium Wars, was not returned to China until 1997. That is 156 years of British control over territory acquired through drug trafficking. For over a century and a half, Britain profited from a colony that exists only because they won a war to force opium on China. And the artifacts stolen from the old Summer Palace? Still in Western museums? Still generating revenue through ticket sales and tourism, China has requested their return repeatedly. The requests are always denied. Sometimes individual items are sold at auction. forcing China to buy back its own stolen property at inflated prices. In 2009, Christie's auction house in Paris sold 2 bronze animal heads looted from the Summer Palace. A Chinese bidder won them for over 30 million euros combined. He then refused to pay, calling the sale illegitimate because the items were stolen property. The auction house sued. The bidder argued that you cannot sell stolen goods and expect payment. The case dragged on for years, eventually settling out of court with the items finally returned to China. But this is the exception. Most looted artifacts remain in Western hands. The broader pattern is one of denial and minimization. British historians who write about the empire tend to focus on other aspects. The railways built in India, the legal systems established in Africa, the parliamentary traditions exported to Canada and Australia. When the Opium Wars are mentioned, they are one item in a long list of colonial conflicts, no more significant than border skirmishes in Afghanistan or punitive expeditions in Sudan. But the scale of what happened in China is different. We are talking about the systematic destruction of a civilization that was, at the time, more advanced and wealthier than any European nation. We are talking about tens of millions of deaths, either directly from opium addiction or indirectly from the conflicts and chaos that addiction enabled. We are talking about the largest drug trafficking operation in human history, run as official state policy. And somehow, this is not a central part of how we understand the British Empire. Somehow, this is a footnote. There are consequences to this historical amnesia. It shapes modern geopolitics in ways most people do not recognize. When China talks about its century of humiliation, they are talking about the period from the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. The Opium Wars are ground zero for Chinese nationalism, the original sin that explains everything that came after. Chinese students learn about the Opium Wars in detail. They learn about Lin Zexu, the hero who tried to save China. They learn about the unequal treaties that carved up their country. They learn about foreign powers forcing drugs on their people. This is not buried history in China. This is foundational history. So when Western nations lecture China about human rights or international law, Chinese officials often bring up the Opium Wars. They point out that the same countries now demanding that China follow rules are the countries that invaded China when China tried to enforce its own laws. They argue that Western nations have no moral authority because they have never acknowledged or atoned for their historical crimes. This is not just rhetoric. This is how historical grievances shape present-day policy. China's insistence on sovereignty, its resistance to foreign intervention, its skepticism of Western institutions, all of this is rooted in the trauma of the Opium Wars and what followed. And Britain's refusal to fully reckon with this history makes reconciliation impossible. How can you move forward when one side will not even admit what happened? There are also modern parallels that are impossible to ignore. The Opium Wars are not ancient history. The patterns repeat. In the 1980s, the CIA facilitated cocaine trafficking to fund Nicaraguan rebels. The drugs flowed into American inner cities, creating the crack epidemic. The government that was supposed to protect its citizens enabled their destruction for geopolitical goals. In Afghanistan, US forces spent 20 years fighting the Taliban, while Afghan opium production reached record highs. Afghanistan, under American occupation, produced more opium than at any other point in history. The US military's official position was that they were not responsible for drug enforcement, even as American-backed warlords controlled the opium trade. And then there is the opioid crisis in America itself. Pharmaceutical companies deliberately addicted millions of Americans to painkillers, using marketing strategies and lobbying power to maximize sales while minimizing scrutiny. Purdue Pharma, maker of OxyContin, knew their drug was highly addictive. They marketed it as safe for chronic pain. They paid doctors to prescribe it. They made billions while hundreds of thousands of Americans died. The parallels are exact. A powerful entity uses drugs as a weapon or profit center. Victims are blamed for their own addiction. Regulators are captured or corrupted. Profits are privatized while suffering is socialized. And when it is all over, the perpetrators avoid real accountability. Britain forced opium on China and faced no consequences. Purdue Pharma addicted millions of Americans and settled for a fine that left the Sackler family billionaires. The patterns persist because we refuse to learn the lesson. The lesson is simple. When profit and power align against human welfare, atrocities become policy, and when those atrocities are not fully acknowledged and punished, they will happen again. So what do we still not know? What questions remain unanswered? Even with the 2016 document release, there are gaps. Many East India Company files remain classified. The British government says this is for national security reasons, but what national security interest is served by hiding 180-year-old documents about opium trafficking? We do not know the full extent of royal family involvement. Queen Victoria clearly knew about the opium trade. She received tax revenue from it. But was she actively involved in policy decisions? Did she approve the wars? We have circumstantial evidence, but not definitive proof, because royal correspondence from this period remains partially sealed. We do not know the true death toll. Estimates range from 10 million to 50 million Chinese deaths attributable directly or indirectly to the opium trade and its consequences over the course of the 19th century. But there was no systematic record keeping. No one was counting the bodies in rural opium dens or tracking how many people died in the chaos of the Taiping Rebellion. The true number is unknowable, which is convenient for those who want to minimize the crime. We do not know if reparations will ever be paid. If you tried to calculate what Britain owes China, accounting for the opium trade, the stolen artifacts, the enforced treaties, the territorial seizures, and compound interest over 175 years, you would arrive at a number in the trillions of dollars. Obviously, this will never be paid, but the fact that it is not even discussed tells you everything about who writes history and who lives with its consequences. What we do know is this: the opium wars were not wars. They were state-sponsored drug trafficking operations backed by military force. They were not about trade. They were about power and profit extracted through deliberate human suffering. And they were not an aberration. They were colonialism, functioning exactly as designed, taking what it wanted by any means necessary, and calling it civilization. The cover-up is ongoing. The forgetting continues. But the evidence exists. The documents are there. The looted artifacts sit in museums. The truth is available to anyone willing to look for it. The question is whether we are willing to see it. And more importantly, whether we are willing to do anything about it. So let us be absolutely clear about what happened here. This was not a trade dispute that got out of hand. This was not a cultural misunderstanding between East and West. This was not the inevitable clash between a traditional empire and a modernizing power. This was the British Empire, at the height of its power, deliberately flooding China with addictive narcotics because it was profitable and strategically useful. This was state-sponsored drug trafficking on a scale that has never been equaled before or since. And when China tried to stop it, when China enforced its own laws in its own territory, Britain responded with military force and called it justice. We have the documents now, the internal memos calculating addiction rates, the production quotas for opium refinement, the bribery ledgers showing payments to Chinese officials, the naval orders to bombard Chinese cities, the looting inventories from the Summer Palace. All of it is real. All of it is documented. There is no ambiguity here. From 1773 to the early 1900s, over 130 years, Britain systematically destroyed Chinese society for profit. 40 million addicts at the peak, tens of millions dead from addiction, war, and the chaos that followed. An empire that controlled 1/3 of global wealth reduced to bankruptcy and dependency. And every step of the way, British officials knew exactly what they were doing. They were not naive. They were not operating with incomplete information. They had reports from their own people describing the human cost. They had Chinese officials begging them to stop. They had members of their own parliament calling it immoral. They knew. And they did it anyway. Because the money was too good. Because the strategic advantage was too valuable. Because they could. And here is what makes this truly enraging. They got away with it. Not just in the sense that they were not punished at the time, though that is true, but in the deeper sense that they successfully rewrote the history. Most people in the West today have no idea this happened. Or if they have heard of the Opium Wars, they think it was some kind of fair fight between equal powers. The systematic nature of the crime, the calculated cruelty of it, the sheer scale of suffering, all of that has been erased from popular memory. British museums still display stolen Chinese artifacts and call them part of their permanent collection. British history books still frame the Opium Wars as minor colonial conflicts. The British government has never apologized, never paid reparations, never even fully acknowledged what happened. Just regret. Just a statement that certain aspects were unfortunate but should be understood in historical context. What context makes state-sponsored drug trafficking acceptable? What context justifies invading a country because it tried to enforce anti-narcotics laws? What context explains looting and burning one of humanity's greatest cultural treasures? There is no context. There is only crime and the refusal to admit it. But this matters beyond historical justice. This matters because the patterns continue. When powerful nations decide that profit or strategy justifies human suffering, when they use their military might to enforce economic exploitation, when they rewrite history to hide their crimes, they are following the playbook written during the Opium Wars. The war on drugs in America, which incarcerated millions, while the CIA facilitated cocaine trafficking, the opioid epidemic, where pharmaceutical companies deliberately created addiction for profit, the ongoing exploitation of developing nations through debt, resource extraction, and military intervention. These are not separate issues. These are the same pattern playing out over and over because we refuse to learn the lesson. The lesson is that power without accountability leads to atrocity, that profit without morality leads to genocide, that empires that cannot face their own history are doomed to repeat it. China remembers. Every Chinese student learns about the Opium Wars. They learn about Lin Zexu destroying the opium and trying to save his country. They learn about British warships bombarding Chinese cities. They learn about the unequal treaties and the century of humiliation that followed. This is not forgotten history in China. This is living history. This shapes how China sees the world today, how it views Western power, how it approaches international relations. And until the West acknowledges what actually happened, until there is genuine reckoning with this history, that wound will never heal. The mistrust will never end. The cycle will continue. So here is my verdict. The Opium Wars were one of the greatest crimes in human history. They were premeditated, systematic, and devastating in their impact. They destroyed one of humanity's greatest civilizations for profit. And the cover-up, the ongoing refusal to fully acknowledge what happened, is almost as damning as the original crime. History is not always written by heroes. Sometimes it is written by drug dealers with armies. And sometimes those drug dealers win. But that does not make them right. It just makes them powerful. And power without justice is just another word for tyranny. This is Mr. H. And if this opened your eyes to a chapter of history that has been deliberately hidden, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this. More crimes that powerful nations want you to forget. More truth that is buried in classified documents and museum archives. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: what other trade wars were actually something much darker? What other conflicts were really about exploitation dressed up as civilization? What other empires built their wealth on the corpses of people they claim to be helping? The answers are out there. We just have to be willing to look. And more importantly, we have to be willing to see what we find. Thanks for watching. And remember, the past is never really past. It is always here, shaping the present, waiting for us to finally tell the truth about it.